as part of our massive open online course titled From Poverty to Prosperity, Understanding Development. And as all the learners enrolled on the course know, they've had a chance to put a lot of questions and vote on questions on the website. And that was very helpful for us to put together the questions that we will start with. And you can continue to ask questions on this page as we're having this conversation, and the questions will be answered as they come in. But to begin with, Paul, thanks for having the time to do this session. And I know this has been a course that you've enjoyed doing. And
it's fantastic reaching so many people.
Yeah, and I think especially today with the technology that we have, and maybe you want to talk about how this changed over the period of you being here in Oxford. But also, I mean, one of the questions that came in talks about how you started the course by defining economic development as a domestic struggle. And the learner is asking, how did globalization change this, and shouldn't development be best considered and analyzed as an inter-country process, not as a domestic struggle?
There clearly is now an element of inter-country processes, inter-country competition and stuff, but I think overwhelmingly it's still a domestic struggle. And what I mean by a domestic struggle is a struggle really to contain the people who want to use violence to appropriate assets from other people. Where we start in the evolution of political power is that struggle that some people have an interest, they've got strength but not much productive ability, and the rational thing for them to do is to abuse that strength by taking stuff from others. And the struggle to actually contain the violent, and especially not just the individual violent, but the large groups of violent, that struggle is still playing out in the world. So I think that's the sort of central struggle to focus on, so that we build societies where people's energies go not in trying to grab stuff from others, but trying to actually, grow the pie, as it were. I think there's a danger in overemphasizing the sort of global aspects, because there's a seductive narrative that crooked leaders use to explain why their country is a mess. And that is the narrative of victimhood. Our country is a victim of somebody else. Yeah. And that is just a strategic narrative by the ruler to get himself off the hook of responsibility for why his country hasn't developed. But to the extent that people believe it, it's very incapacitating. If you believe you're a victim, you're stuck. Yeah. And so I wanted to sort of give people back this sense, it's a struggle. That's how every successful society has been built, by people winning that struggle. Yeah. And in some societies, that's still very much being fought.
And I think in the course you beautifully outlined this journey of struggle, of trying to form into a centralized state and then going into the inclusive state. And one of the questions was asking if you think there is a right time to transition to democracy as is known in the world today, and should a society ever not make that transition to democracy, i.e., is there a wrong time to go to democracy, and is there a right time for it?
Let me,
very politically sensitive question.
Let me start fudge by saying it depends what you mean by democracy. If
Yes.
you mean, electoral competition, elections every 4 or 5 years, multi-parties competing in those elections, then I don't think that's for everywhere all the time. No, I think it works where it works in rather particular circumstances. Yeah. And in a lot of, it's been tried in a lot of societies where it really, really hasn't worked, I think, where the society started with too many divisions of identity, so that the political parties organized around those divisions of identity, you know, ethnic or religious, and then the policy disputes are not about what will be the best strategy for the country. It would be the disputes are what's the best strategy for my group against your group, and always with democracy, you know, the narratives are vilification of the opposing political organization. But if you've got that structured around these identities, religious, ethnic, then you can never build a united society, a shared identity. It just fractionalizes. I mean, just look what's happened in Kenya. That seems to me the story.
And talking about identities, as you said and explained in the course, that when you have these multiple identities that are not sharing much, one way is to build a common identity for the nation. And one of the questions was asking how difficult or how dangerous that could be, as kind of privileging one dominant language over another for identity building can backfire and be divisive by making minorities feel alienated. So kind of the balance between minority rights and common identities.
I think nowadays there's only one way to build shared identity, and that is on some characteristic that everybody shares regardless of any other characteristics.
Okay.
And that is belonging. You know, if you all basically belong to the same country, grown up in the same country, whatever, that is, and we know that is actually a very powerful psychological effect. I didn't talk about it in the course, but we now know that there's a very powerful instinct, what's called territoriality. People bond with place.
Right.
And we know that's not even something produced by narratives and language. It can be reinforced by that, but it's hardwired in us, and not just into Homo sapiens. It turns out that all species for the last 4 million years are hardwired to this attachment to territory. And we see it in the ratio of defenders to attackers. The attackers tend to lose unless there are a lot of them. And that's true across these species. So trying to build a shared identity through saying, I'm the nation and you're not, that clearly is not going to work. You know? So that's an abuse of the concept of a nation. It's very obviously not a shared identity. Saying we're going to use my language and not yours is an abuse. You know? But some of the best leaders have really managed to get around that. So, for example, in language, Sukarno in Indonesia, Nyeri in Tanzania, they both chose a language. Sukarno is very much a new language, Bahasa, a new simple language, which managed to unite an incredibly large and diverse population scattered over, I think, more than 3,000 inhabited islands. And so he did that. Nyerere did the same thing in Tanzania. I think I talked about it a bit in the course there. So there are ways of getting a shared identity, and there are clearly illegitimate ways in which one group tries to hijack the notion of the nation and say, we're the nation and not you. That's not nation building, that's division building.
Well, that's a very useful way of putting it. And moving on from identity, we talked in the course about urbanization as a way to kind of harvest the economies of scale. And I know we had some of this discussion before, but how do you see the balancing between urban development versus rural development, especially that a lot of countries have huge majority of the population in rural areas, and there's a kind of a time challenge. Do you build urban as they come, or do you fix rural as they're there now?
I think, first of all, we do have to, I think, accept that the arrow of the future says most people in most countries will be urban.
Yeah.
So that the urban economy is really the driver of national productivity. It's not making a city work is not a strategy for the urban population, it's a strategy for the national population. Because that higher income in the city, one of the things it will be spent upon is food that can be produced in the rural areas. And so the rural economy will certainly marketize the idea that the rural economy is some isolated bunch of subsistence producers. That's ridiculous. So the rural economy will be integrated through markets into the urban economy, and as the urban economy prospers, the rural economy will prosper. The rural economy will also change. It will become a dense network of smaller towns, a hierarchy of towns, in which you get different services performed at different levels. So we don't need to get to sort of ever larger metropolises. At some stage, the metropolis becomes just so big that it's dysfunctional, it becomes congested. So increasingly, countries will need to develop strategies for secondary and tertiary cities, and this sort of network of market towns, which enable people in the rural economy to prosper both with agriculture and in non-urban, non-agriculture. Africa is very strikingly different from South Asia in that a much higher proportion of rural income in Africa is from agriculture.
Right.
And the overall level of income in rural Africa is much lower. And so there's, you sort of want to urbanize at a small scale the rural economy,
right,
so that it becomes more prosperous and more diversified.
And one of the challenges, and you spoke a little bit in the course about facing urbanization, is the slums, which we see in a lot of big cities. And one of the questions was on what's the best way to deal with slums without forcefully evacuating slum dwellers.
Yeah, I mean, I should also say there's force and force. I mean, there's coordinated relocation. My own father was cleared from a slum in Sheffield in about 1939. And the centre of Sheffield was a slum. The city council, very democratic council, but it decided, right, we're going to clear this slum and we'll build housing elsewhere for the people in the slum. So the whole community was relocated to a new area with better housing. Now, you can't have that process blocked by, three old people who say, I'm born here, I grew up here, I'm not moving no matter what. So there has to be some element of coercion. That's a very different matter from saying we're going to bulldoze your slum and leave you without anywhere to go. So there's a continuum here. There are collective rights as well as individual rights, and at some stage collective rights are legitimately trumping individual rights, I think. But I think the core of the answer is try and get ahead of the process of urban settlement, so that you start to get some space around the town which is properly demarcated with sites and services and plots and the required infrastructure, the road network, the sewage, the water, the electricity underneath the road, all there ready to be connected. And then people themselves can be given or buy plots, and then they themselves can gradually finance building some accommodation on that plot.
Yeah.
Ethiopia, which has been doing this sort of relocation a bit in Addis, has worked with a system of lottery. So people are allowed to buy new property, but it's done by lottery. So you win a lottery ticket to the right to buy early, or you have to wait. And invariably, families take, if they win the lottery ticket,
yeah,
they think they've won something, and they find the money and they take it. So
yeah,
that's a way of gradually emptying a slum,
yeah,
without just going in with bulldozers.
Yeah, yeah. Another question is asking about the effect of colonialism, and how did, in your view, colonialism interrupt the process in Africa of this state formation, if we could call it? And is that one of the reasons why, in a lot of places, due to colonialism, they are stuck in some stage of not having an economy of scale in violence, as you say in the course?
Yeah, it's it's hard to sketch such a grand counterfactual as suppose Africa hadn't been occupied by these colonial powers. Of course, bits of it weren't. I mean, sort of the Ethiopia, Botswana, in effect, managed to carve enough independence out that they, and indeed, Ethiopia did consolidate as a state. So maybe left to itself, Africa would have done more of that consolidation. Of course, in colonial times, it was pretty lightly populated, so it was more. It wasn't at the extreme end of Aboriginal Australia,
right,
where quite clearly there was, left to its own devices for 60,000 years, Aboriginal Australia wasn't forming states.
Right.
Africa clearly was forming some states, and so probably, yes, if it had been left to its own devices, it would have formed more. How that guides us now, I'm not sure. We've sort of got the states we've got. It would be nice to see a process of state consolidation into federations. And there's a little bit of that. East African Community, ECOWAS, a little bit of that. And I think that's the right way to go.
Right.
I think Africa's in a way got too many states.
Right.
Of course, the pressures of fragmented identity try and push in the opposite direction. Yeah. Eritrea peeled off from Ethiopia and is now a very unhappy place. Yeah. And South Sudan peeled off from Sudan and is an even more unhappy place. Yeah. So Africa's political pressures of fragmentation have proved to be, really anti-developmental journeys. And I think the difficulty with getting the consolidated states like East African Union is that so much power in Africa is centralized at the level of the president.
Right.
That the presidents don't want to give up power. Yeah. You turn 3 countries into a federation, who's going to be the president? Yeah. And that would be solved if you had just a more sort of decentralized political power structure.
Yeah. And do you think that all states or all countries have to go through this process as you outlined in the course and go through this historical cycle? Or with today's world and technology and everything, is that going to be shortened in a way? And
well, I certainly hope.
Will we see it in our generation?
We wouldn't possibly want the same process as consolidated states in Europe. I mean, violence is an awful way to consolidate states. I mean, so and the costs of violence have got higher and higher as the technologies of violence have got more and more damaging. So Africa has to, and other regions, have to find a way of state consolidation or state cooperation that works better than that doesn't depend upon being driven by violence, really.
Yeah.
There are some helpful currents there. I think one of the things that some of the founding leaders of Africa did, like Nkrumah, was to build narratives of Pan-African identity.
Right.
And so, sort of paradoxically, I think certainly in Africa, there's a much stronger sense of Pan-African identity than there is in Europe of Pan-European identity. So in Africa, identities tend to be either highly localized or continent-wide. And using that sort of continent-wide sense of identity would be, I think, very helpful.
And if we compare Africa with Latin America, have you noticed any significant differences in terms of their approach towards development policies?
Yeah, I think they're very, very different. I think I tend to think of Latin America as much more, I mean, this has got to be broad sweep.
Yeah,
right?
continent to continent.
But I think Latin America is much more focused on disputes about ideologies.
Right.
And much less focused on disputes about identity. I mean, these are sweeping statements, but it was a sweeping question. Yeah. So I think in Latin America, first of all, it's got this oppositional identity towards North America. So there's a sort of narrative of victimhood there, which is, like all narratives of victimhood, there's some truth in it, but it's actually quite a damaging narrative. It's incapacitating. And Latin American regimes have sort of veered between ideologies of sort of populist Marxism and ideologies of some ideologies of fascism, but certainly also ideologies of the sort of liberal market unrestrained, and trying to get out of those two ideologies to something a bit more central. That seems to me to be Latin America's struggle. It's a struggle around some ideas that have been hugely costly for a lot of societies in Latin America, most obviously Venezuela at the moment. Whereas Africa, surprisingly, very few of the disputes have really been sort of ideological. Not many Marxist states in Africa, not many, sort of free market economist states. So, but much more disputes about who can control the state, which ethnic group, faction can control the state. Both are fairly dysfunctional, but the origins of the dysfunction is very different.
And what's your take on these ideological approaches to policy making, but in general? Where do you sit on this debate?
I'm a pragmatist, right? And there's an old philosophical tradition called pragmatism. It's not just a populist word. And what the tradition meant of pragmatism was, first of all, there are no universal eternal truths. Right? Those belong to ideology. Right? I think of an ideology as a bit like an answering machine for a telephone, that no matter what question you ask it, it'll spit out an answer without really listening. So pragmatism starts from the idea there are no universal eternal truths. Truth has to be ground out of a context, a spatial and temporal context, here now. And the criterion for determining truth is, does it work?
Yeah.
Does it do what it says on the tin? And so to my mind, that is the sort of eternal struggle in societies, is to free yourself on the one hand from these ideologies, on another from populism, which populism isn't ideological, it's just opportunist. It comes up with things that sound plausible for 2 minutes, but they don't work. And so pragmatism, you free yourself from the ideology, but you then do the hard work of thinking what, given the evidence, will actually work in this context. So it's a two-front war, pragmatism. On the one hand, it's against the eternal truths of ideology, and the other, it's against the 2-minute analysis of populism. And boy, we see both of these things, not just in poor societies, but in rich ones.
Yeah, all over.
Yeah.
That's a very good way, I think, of looking at it. And the next couple questions move us to more the international scene and what we're seeing at that level. And one of the questions asked that some countries are behaving internationally as the thugs that we talked about in our course.
I can't think which ones you might mean, but yes, I guess.
And so inclusivity is elusive.
That was a joke, by the way.
in global governance institutions. So what do you suggest should the marginalized and smaller countries do? Should they adopt the method of protest? If yes, how? And if no, how else?
My gut instinct here is to say, don't let these rather ridiculous international things distract you from the core struggle. And the core struggle is domestic in poor countries. You're poor because you've not yet won that domestic struggle. The international environment may well make that harder. You know, in some countries like yours, it makes it a lot harder. But basically, a lot of energy has to go into winning these domestic struggles, and also there are a lot of economic opportunities for all countries there for the taking. And so that's, to my mind, the priority for the use of energy. Now, in some things, can your voice still be important? I think, for example, in the climate change disputes, and I think it's important for poor countries to say, look, we're suffering from the consequences of global warming, and it's the responsibility of the countries that have got big emissions to do something about it. And that it is absolutely illegitimate of powerful countries to use their power to coerce poor countries into reducing emissions whilst they themselves are not doing so. So I think that's an example of where voice matters.
And staying on this international theme, there's a question about tax havens, and we talked about the flows of money that comes out of developing countries, and how it's even larger than any flows coming in development or anything. And what do you think, is there any hope for global cooperation to end this, especially the tax haven issue?
I think so. I mean, I've fought this fight myself.
Yeah.
I was pulled into the 2013 G8 meeting and persuaded the British government that they really ought to focus on this. Yeah. Greatly helped by the scandal over Starbucks coffee, which had sold billions of cups of coffee without making any taxable profits in Britain. It's becoming more evident that even the rich economies are losing a lot of tax revenue through the abuse of the fact that companies have gone global and tax has stayed national. And so it should be feasible to build an alliance between the governments of rich countries and governments of poor countries to cooperate on quite a lot of stuff. There eventually there are going to be areas where there are just hard conflicts of interest between, do you pay tax in a poor country or a rich one? But at the moment, the reality is companies are paying tax in neither. And so it's, at the moment, it should be feasible to find mutual gains.
And one last question on this same trend of, I mean, we're seeing an increased globalization and interdependence of processes and finance and everything. And at the same time, we're seeing this other trend of more nationalistic and protectionist movement. What's your thoughts about where these two, what seems contradictory trends would end up?
Yeah, I mean, I think the trends towards protectionism are quite scary. So I think that, in a way, the gains from globalization have been so unevenly spread. China's made huge gains from globalization. It's been the big winner. And so if China's desperate to protect an open world economy, that's why President Xi at Davos earlier this year became the great global champion of open trade. I think if China wants to make that a political reality in the world, the benefits of trade are going to have to be spread more widely, and so the absolute dominance of China in manufacturing has got to get spread more widely. China's got to take manufacturing to other countries, so that there's a larger community of gains.
And in that case, what do you think would happen to more small and medium enterprise? And we talked a little bit about that in the course. And is there space in this global economy for SMEs to be part of that, or is it only the large corporations that can play in this field?
No, I think this is an area where new technologies might even actually help in increasing access to global market chains for certainly medium-sized companies. So I think it will be. I don't think we'll see the race being won just by big companies. I think it'll be smaller companies stitched into supply chains, maybe anchored by big companies, but I think it's perfectly feasible for smaller companies to get in there. Um, but I mean, having said that, the data point to greater concentration in a lot of industries. The bigger companies are taking a larger market share. So that may be just a phase of a particular history of technology, but it may well not be permanent. These, for a long period, you've got firms going into vertical integration, more and more being done in the same firm in the same site.
Yeah.
Then for the last 40 years, that's been unwound, and you've had vertical disintegration with everything produced in different locations.
Yeah.
Now with the sort of 3D printing and that sort of stuff, and,
automation and all
then,
that. Yeah.
then there's some greater tendency towards bringing stuff back. So maybe there are sort of cycles in these things.
And where do you think this new trend of what's called the fourth industrial revolution, or AI and 3D printing and automation, where does that affect the path that some of these countries have to get out of poverty?
I think the scarier technological development for countries that haven't broken into manufacturing is robotics.
Yes.
And there's a window of, I don't know, 10, 20 years during which robotics are just too expensive to bother with for a lot of tasks. And that's the window where, in effect, we've got to get stuff out of China and into poor countries.
Right.
And once countries get on the escalator, then they gradually move up. The skills accumulate. Goodness knows where artificial intelligence will head. In many ways, it's more of a threat to the skill, to the knowledge-based activities of the advanced economies.
Yeah.
I was in Singapore last week and talking to a distraught hedge fund manager who'd just discovered that AI could outperform him in a lot of stuff, and so his future was going to be, at best, integrated with AI.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's a hedge fund manager, not somebody trying to get a job making T-shirts. You know, so I think AI is actually unlikely to be a threat for poor countries for a long time yet, whereas the robotics 20 years. So the message there is, get on with it.
Get on quickly. And speaking about Singapore, there's a question here which may be a bit tricky, but if you were an investor, because it got a lot of votes, so if you were an investor, in what developing economies would you invest? Not from a humanitarian perspective, but financial. Which nations are the Singapores of the future?
Do you know, I don't answer those questions. Partly because it will be grossly unfair to sort of highlight a few. Partly because it's genuinely rather difficult. What I do sometimes advise investors, and what I invariably tell them is go for a portfolio that's a bit diversified. Don't think you can spot one winner. I remember in the mid-1990s, seeing investor survey evidence exactly answering this question: where was going to be the next Singapore?
Yeah.
And it was rating a whole range of African countries, which was going to make it to Singapore.
Yeah.
And there was an overwhelming consensus. There's only one country that was going to be Singapore. It was Eritrea.
Okay.
Nobody would say that now. Nobody would say that now. Yeah. Right? What actually turned into Singapore was the absolute tragic basket case of the time, which was Rwanda.
Yeah.
So these things are fairly unpredictable, but you need to take a portfolio approach. If I had to choose a couple at the moment which I guess I ought to, I'd say Ghana and Senegal both look quite attractive, really.
Right. And I guess for a lot of these countries, what made the difference is maybe less, and this is one of the questions, is it maybe less the plan or the ideas, but the execution of it? And that's where a lot of countries seem to struggle, like policy execution. So what would be your advice to, how do we transform these into the ground and execute them?
So let's go back to the course. There are the good, good economic policies based on this sort of tripod of get the rules right, get the public sector teams right, the motivated teams with the proper mandate, and get a critical mass of citizens to understand what's going on so that they actually support them. And I think I see that in both Senegal and Ghana. I think it's only recent, but recently in both countries they've managed to build that critical mass of informed citizens who understands what's needed. Interestingly, both presidents won not on campaigns saying we'll bribe you with your own money, we'll spend a lot of money. They won on rather prudent policies saying, actually we've overspent. We're inheriting something that's difficult. So that was the critical mass. I think the hardest part is actually building the motivated teams within government. And that's hard because if you start with a big unmotivated bureaucracy, it's very hard to get to turn that round, and you have to turn it round one team at a time. I like to think of 4 stages in all sort of public activities. There's the sort of design of whatever project you're undertaking, you're going to do. That's an easy bit. There's selecting from a load of options. You're going to do this and not that. That's the highly political bit. Where there's a danger that politicians get carried away. And then there's implementation, which is a matter of really monitoring, building a capacity to monitor what is happening, and finally there's evaluation, where you've got to learn from your mistakes. And so a good public policy management is those 4 components. Implementation, and there's quite a useful new index put out by the International Monetary Fund called the Public Investment Management Assessment, PIMA. I've been badgering them for years to do this, and they've finally done it. And it evaluates, for about 100 countries, each of these 4 features. So you can see how good is implementation, public management implementation in my country. I remember looking at 8 countries in West Africa, and if they'd combined the best score from each of the 8 countries, they'd been ranked 4th in the world. As it was, each country was pretty lowly ranked. And so the message I took from that was there's a lot that neighbours can learn from each other, really. So some countries, some poor countries, have got actually pretty good implementation.
Yeah.
Go learn what they do.
Yeah. Let's move to a slightly more technical question, because in the module where we talk about external flows and how domestic links to the more international level, we talk about flows in trade in goods and services, and we introduced that concept of comparative advantage there. But we also talk about capital and labor flows, which are defined by absolute advantage more than comparative advantage. And there's a question to explain more about these concepts of comparative and absolute advantage and how it relates to these three types of flows.
Yeah. So if we start with comparative advantage, this is the idea that if we take two countries, now it may be that one country in an absolute sense is more productive at everything than the other country. But that doesn't mean that the other country has no opportunity to export. Mm-hmm. What matters for the two countries for trade is prior to trade, what do their relative prices look like? So let's suppose there's two countries and two goods. Mm-hmm. Right? And in the highly productive country, it's twice as productive as the less productive country in the first good, but 4 times as productive in the second good. Mm-hmm. So in that first country, that second good will be cheaper. Relative to the other good. Mm-hmm. And so that's the good that it can export. Conversely, if the good that it's relatively bad at making, it's only twice as productive.
Right.
Because that's more expensive than the other good.
Yeah.
That's the good that the unproductive country can export.
Right.
Right? So what should we take? Senegal exports groundnuts to Latin America. It doesn't have to be in any absolute sense more productive, more groundnuts per square kilometer, more groundnut production per worker.
Yeah.
It just has to be better at groundnuts relative to whatever it is that Brazil is exporting. You know, Brazil's exporting orange juice to Senegal because Brazil's much better at growing oranges and selling orange juice. Mm. So Brazil sells the orange juice, Senegal sells the groundnuts. So that's comparative advantage.
Right.
And that's what determines flows of trading goods.
And both have something to win out of
both, that's right.
trade.
And because of that, that's very important. Right? Because of that, there's mutual gain.
Yeah. But you mentioned once how this is one of the most difficult concepts to get, and Bill Clinton has something to say.
Yeah, that's right. So the idea of mutual gains from trade is very hard to get through. Europe, still, a lot of Europeans still have this mindset of trade is a zero-sum game. The old idea a few centuries ago was called mercantilism,
right,
where you just wanted to export and not import.
Right.
If you think about it, that's really stupid. You're sending goods out of the country and never getting anything back. What are you doing it for? You know. So it's clearly not. It's not a sensible strategy. I mean, in the end, China had a huge export surplus with the rest of the world. It exported far more than it imported, and it accumulated trillions of dollars of money, which it then lent to America at very, very low interest rates. So was that smart? Who knows? Probably not. But absolute advantage is what dictates flows of capital and labor. Right? Africa is hemorrhaging something like $200 billion worth of capital a year to other regions.
Right.
And one of the drivers of that is that risk corrected, people see the people who own the wealth see higher returns, say in Brazil or in China, than they do in Africa. And so the capital flows out. Is that good for Africa? Obviously not.
Right.
Is it good for the individual wealth holders?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're getting a higher return. But it's not good for the continent as a whole, because that capital should be working with African workers, making them more productive.
Yeah.
Instead, it's making Brazilian or Chinese workers more productive.
Yeah. And in terms of labor flows, or looking specifically at what's sometimes called as forced flows, which is refugee movements. And one of the questions is asking, how could a country deal with the flow of refugees when it already has a high unemployment rate, for example, and is hit by a wave of refugees? How would that country?
Yeah, I think there was an example given of Turkey, wasn't there?
Yes,
yeah. Turkey's, it's a big country, got 90 million people. It's got about 3 million refugees. So the refugees are not big relative to the labour market. Mm. But I worked a lot on this the last few years. I've got a book called Refuge, which is just on the shortlisted for a book prize in Germany at the moment. But what Refuge argues is that the right thing for the rich countries, Europe and America, to do is to provide the money and the jobs which makes it feasible for the haven countries like Turkey to actually provide jobs for refugees, because what's being brought to Turkey is enough jobs that there are more jobs for Turks as well as for the refugees.
Right.
And that's the agreement that was reached with Governor Jordan. Yeah. Where the agreement with the government of Jordan was that for every 70 jobs brought for refugees, there'd be 30 jobs brought for Jordanians. And so far, that's now called the Jordan model. It's being adopted in Ethiopia. It's being adopted, I think, in Malaysia. And that seems to me to be a sort of much more viable future. Mm. What actually happened in 2011, when the big refugee flood out of Syria started, was that the rich countries just sat on their hands and said, oh, that's Turkey's problem, that's Jordan's problem. Yeah. And that was a disgrace.
Great. I mean, we have 5 more minutes, so I'm going to ask maybe one more question, and then I'll give you a chance to have any final thoughts that you want to share with everyone on the course and everyone watching. But there's a question about common currencies. Are they the next stage in global economic development? Do you think the EU will fragment further? And how does African common currencies, is that a good idea to have an African common currency?
Yeah, I think everything we learned from the euro is that common currencies are really difficult.
Right.
The euro's been very good for Germany and 1 or 2 other very low inflation countries, and very bad for Southern Europe, where the tradition was higher inflation.
Right.
And so it's produced very high rates of youth unemployment across Southern Europe, combined with the bonanza in Germany. So I think the message from that experience is be cautious. I used to be much more enthusiastic about common currencies than I am now, and I think the real difficulty is that unless you're able to build a lot of political integration,
right,
they're dangerous animals.
Right.
In East Africa, I gave a talk 3 or 4 years ago in Arusha to the assembled finance ministers from the East African community. And I said, so here's the challenge. If you've got a common currency, and it's an election in your country, but not in the other countries, are you going to be able to tell your president, sorry, this year, I know you'd like us to spend a lot of money, but we can't.
Yeah.
Because we no longer control the currency. We can't print it.
Right.
And I have to say, all the finance ministers started laughing. So the political realities are that unless you're willing to share a lot more power
Yeah.
than at the moment African countries are sharing,
Right.
then and that sharing of power means you then converge on inflation rates, the same inflation rate,
Yeah.
because you're doing the same fiscal deficits in each country.
Yeah.
And I think we're a long way from that.
Yeah.
You know.
So in a way, there has to be a lot of coordination on fiscal policies, monetary policies, everything. It's not just a common currency.
Build the common state
Yeah.
before you build the symbols.
Yeah.
Symbols first produces the danger of car crashes, I think.
Yeah. Well, that was very useful, and I think we covered as many questions as we can within the hour that we had, and I wanted, before giving you the last 2 minutes, to give any final thoughts, to thank everyone that helped put the course together, the great team from across the university and our partners, and within the Blavatnik School of Government as well. And I think this was a great chance to at least get your direct thoughts on some of these questions, and I'll leave the last 2 minutes for any final thoughts.
Thank you. I want the last 2 minutes because what I've not had a chance to say in this course is thanks, Rafat. Rafat has been the anchor behind this course. I'm the front man, but there's actually a team of nearly 20 people who put this course together, and Rafat has really anchored that team. So don't thank me, thank him.
Thanks a lot, Paul. That was the easiest thing to do. Well, that concludes our hour of live Q&A. I hope you've enjoyed it, and next week we launch our final assignment. And so good luck in your final assignment, and we hope to all the success to you.
I really should add, thank you for having followed this. I hope you found it useful and thought-provoking. You don't have to agree with it, but you do have to be stimulated by it. And I hope you spread the word, both the content and the idea that you can actually watch this thing, to other people, because I'm sure we'll broadcast it again.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.